Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dove. We've got another podcast with Steve Bechtel. So Steve Bechtel is here with me today, and we've got Katja Dove, as always.
Hello.
We're going to continue on. Hello. We're going to continue on our training series, and this one is a spicy, juicy topic of power endurance. I find that this is kind of the harder energy system to talk about and really just to convince people of like what it is and what it's not. So we're going to dive in really deep today and hopefully just like cover this topic more than maybe anyone else has for climbing. Like that's kind of the goal. I sent Steve a ton of questions. So we're going to kind of dive in. So let's do this. Steve Bechtel, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. This is going to be a good topic for me because I wrote a book called Power Endurance about I don't know 10 or 15 years ago, and and it was during a time in my life that I was really interested in getting better at that particular part of my training, and I studied it really deeply, and then I wrote this book, and then I kept studying it, and the more I learned, the more I realized that the book, although not wrong, is well, let's say not even wholly wrong, but not it's not nearly as broad as I would hope. And it's really a book about what you should do for about 3 weeks a year. And then the rest of the time we should be doing other things. And so I want to talk about the pivot from that because a lot of people have read that book and then it's become sort of a like the I hate it because it becomes this like stake in the ground of like here's how you need to train, but it's how you need to train again during a very limited part of your training.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually have that book. It is actually very good because the drills are really, they're fun and they're different. So I do recommend you can still get that book from Steve's website. So it's good for some like new drills for power endurance. Okay, so let's get started. We've talked about endurance, we've talked about strength, specific strength, we've talked about power. So what is power endurance in the grand scheme of things?
Well, again, I think that science is really interesting because everything that we're sure we know right now will be proven wrong in 50 years. And if we went back, 100 years from today, and we were looking at the way they trained athletes, it's completely different. There at one point they believed that smoking actually helped increase the strength of the lungs, and so they encouraged athletes to smoke cigarettes because they benefit from that. And we're pretty sure that that's not true now, but we need to continue with our development of how we see athletes perform. The really critical part of this is that we need to be looking both in science and in practice. The scientists follow the practitioners. And so if you really want to develop high levels of strength and endurance and power right now, it's super important that you don't wait until the research comes out and you want to like go, how are the best climbers in the world training endurance and how are they staying on the wall when I'm falling off? And so we want to always be balancing those two things. So really simplistically, early on, climbers put forth this model of way over here is endurance, and then we have power endurance because it's the thing that's between endurance and power. And then we have over here maximal strength. And so we'd have this continuum. And although that continuum is a good starting point, it's really critical to understand that power endurance exists in this middle energy system where power outputs are not very high and endurance is not very long. And it requires this glycolytic energy system, which is really, really inefficient. Using the glycolytic energy system would be like driving down the highway with your car in third gear. you're burning a ton of gas, the engine's being really high, it's very, very hard on the machine. And eventually something really bad is going to happen. And so when we look at power endurance, it's the reason we feel like we need it is because we know what happens when we don't have it. We get there on the rock, we get super duper pumped, we come down, we can't even tie our knot, or we get destroyed in a long bouldering session, and you're like, oh, why don't I have the, power endurance or the X for this need from my body? And so we just started going, oh, if I want to get good at this, I just need to go into that zone of getting as pumped as possible, as quickly as possible. And what it turns out is that that's a really bad idea if you want long-term development. And the overall gist of this is we need to create a body or create an athlete that is good at not getting pumped rather than getting good at handling being pumped. And those are two different processes.
It was amazing. Thank you so much, Steve. I want to add something. I don't know if you actually knew this, Steve, but I actually used to be a scientist. So I really appreciate what you said about science, and I just want to throw it out there, and that's true in general, is that people have this idea that science, states the absolute truth. Whereas science is actually an endless process, kind of like a very dynamic process to discover what works. And so I really love what you said, which is, yeah, let's look at the sciences, let's listen to the science, but let's also look at the practitioners and the practical advice and what are we actually learning in the field. Because science is also limited in that, we only know what we study in science. So certain studies need to be done. So I think it's really important for people to keep in mind when they train or when they even work on other things in their lives that, yeah, science can suggest some things, but it's not the ultimate truth. And certainly just because science has not shown something does not mean it's not true either.
Yeah, that's a great point. The
Yeah.
energetics, like the whole idea of delivering fuel to the body is super complicated, and it's really confusing. And even the best coaches I've ever worked with have big questions. They're like, hey, what about this? I don't understand this process. And so one of the things that I want to start out with today is that we want to look at the individual athlete and where is this athlete limited? And there can be some pretty substantial limitations. The first limitation, even before we get into the physical limitations, is an emotional or arousal based limitation. And really what it is if you're afraid, you cannot out train that. And what that means is there's some really interesting research about arousal levels in endurance sports. Like if I go to the starting line and I'm super duper nervous I'm going to run a 10K, I can go into that race with such an elevated heart rate, constricted muscles, bad form because I'm holding my muscles tight, that I can actually destroy my endurance without actually having a fitness limitation. I'm actually limited by my arousal level. And so if you compare being nervous at the start of a 10K to the way that people feel when they're really run out way up on a cliff, it's not even in the same league. And so if we have somebody that deals with fear issues and feels like they need to top rope a route over and over and over to get their endurance up so that they're going to be brave enough to do this route, they're chasing the wrong rabbit. And what we're looking at is this person needs to step back and go through emotional and mental training processes rather than physical training processes. Because like I said, no number of circuits or endurance in the world is going to fix that artificially high arousal level. And so that's a big limiter. So we want to start with that. Like, don't start your power endurance programming if you're afraid to lead routes in your gym, for example. Okay, the next thing is when we look at the physical capabilities of an athlete, there's really three places where an athlete can be limited when it comes to endurance. One of them is actually uptake of fuel. And generally, endurance will have an oxygen-based fueling. And so we can have people that don't have the respiratory capacity to bring oxygen into the lungs and move it through the lungs and into the blood. And so that's uptake limited. And that's the most rare kind of limitation. But we can have people that have weak inspiratory muscles. They don't have really great development. And the great way to do that is through general cardiorespiratory training to improve uptake. Again, not too many people have that limitation, but if you're a person that's like, whoa, I just don't feel like I can get a full breath, that's a possibility. The second level of limitation is delivery, the ability to take that oxygen and move it through the bloodstream and to the muscles. And that's we talk about capillarity, the ability to get blood to the muscles that need them. Lots of people don't have great development in their upper body, for example. You can be an excellent endurance runner or a cyclist, but not have the endurance or the capillary network to bring blood to the proper parts of your body. And so we can be limited by that. And the answer there is to do endurance activity with our upper bodies. And that can be climbing, or it could be something like swimming or cross-country skiing, or using the cardiorespiratory machine that involves the arms. But we need to start developing the blood flow. The third place is utilization of that delivered oxygen. And that's actually happens within the muscle. And we talk about mitochondria, we talk about muscular endurance and all those sorts of things. And this is where most people start to address their endurance. They're like, oh, I can't use my grip for a long time, so I'm going to do a gripper tool for 30 minutes and improve my muscular endurance. And so that's the utilization end of it. And that's also not quite as rare or as common as the delivery. And so the least common is uptake. The most common is a delivery limitation. And then we also have utilization. And so the lucky thing with climbing endurance training is we operate across all three of those, but primarily in muscular endurance and in delivery of the blood. And so those things are really key to keep in mind as we move forward into talking about the specific nuts and bolts of power endurance training. I know it's a lot of background for this, but I think people need to have the mindset of it's not just like, can I handle being pumped?
Totally. Do you want to go into kind of the different mechanisms, especially so we're talking about energy utilization, like energy production. How would you like to move forward? Because you did send me this really awesome graphic that I would love
Yeah.
to share with our audience, and we will try to explain it verbally.
Yeah.
But best is to look at the video.
So let's move past those limitation things, but they tie into this, right? And so when we look at the energy equation, is really kind of this basic framework is for all the things that we do, we need to have energy production in order to expend energy. If you didn't eat food, eventually you would die because you would have no more fuel. And so when we look at the energy production end of it, we want to do energy system development. That's what ESD means. We're going to do the exercises. We also can change the muscle size and fiber type of the affected muscles, or develop those. You can't really change the muscle fiber types profoundly in most people, but we can improve the slow twitch muscles and improve their ability to sustain harder efforts. And then nutrition's a big part of it. Do we have the available fuel to make sure we have a good session? Fasted cardio is like a real hot topic right now. And people are really into like, oh, the more fasted cardio I do, the better I'm ramping up my metabolism and whatnot. But for the most part, when we're doing high intensity sport specific endurance training, we want to make sure that we're fueled up properly. And this is the one time I really love sports drinks and things like that, is when we're actually doing endurance activity, like drinking a whatever brand of sports drink you love, while you're doing endurance circuits, or while you're hiking in the mountains, or whatever, is an excellent time to do it. And then I don't feel like you should be drinking carbohydrate any other time in your life. You should, fuel the activity and then drop it. And so those three things go into the energy production end of things. And then energy expenditure is really what we're doing when we're actually out there climbing routes. And so we want to think about our movement capacity, which is this overall ability to do lots and lots of moves and to do them as efficiently as possible. And that kind of bleeds into the skill and technique part of it. The key to really great climbing endurance is to not use as much energy. And we really want to think about that. Like I want to be as more and more efficient so I don't have to have an infinite capacity of endurance in my forearms. If I'm a bad rock climber, there's again, if I'm afraid or if I'm a terrible climber, there's no amount of work that these muscles can do that are going to save you. You've really got to think about that economy. And then finally, mental performance was that third bit of it. And mental performance is not only being afraid, it's having good tactics and strategies at the crag. Or in the gym, am I resting enough in between? If I'm doing 5-minute circuits with 10 minutes rest in between, I'm going to have a lot of time to expend energy and to develop these abilities. But if I'm doing 5-minute intervals with 1-minute rest in between, I'm going to get really, really tired really, really quick. I'm not going to address those systems for very long. And I'm going to leave the gym going like, oh my gosh, I must have had a great workout because I'm exhausted. But really the key that it all comes down to is how many moves and at what level can I do per unit time? Can I do a lot of V3 moves in the time period of a week? Or can I only do a couple of them because I got really, really pumped after my first session and then I need 3 days of rest? And so if we keep going back to that model of like, am I doing more climbing? More climbing, I mean, the world's simplest formula is more climbing equals more endurance. And really that's true, whether it's repeated boulders in a gym setting or lots of times on routes or many, many days in a row, and we can scale on up. But lots of people want to have really great endurance, but don't actually do all that much climbing. And that's the biggest limiter for most of us.
Yeah, and I think you said something really important that like a minute ago was that rest time in between the work. That if you're not resting enough, no matter what, you're actually not going to improve the energy production, even like the mechanisms inside of your structures if you don't rest enough.
Yeah.
And you're also probably not going to improve your skill or your movement capacity or your technique. So I think that
requires a lot of time. And we can look at that in a lot of different ways. One of them is like, if you don't feel like rest is appropriate, you should just try to not go to sleep one night and then have an effective work day the next day. Clearly that doesn't happen. Like we need that kind of recovery. The other way that we look at this, and this is a really great thing, is to see how quickly you can do 100 pull-ups. Most of us can't do 100 pull-ups in a single set. And so my friend Nick Zarnecki and I, 15 years ago, were like, let's see how quick we can do 100 pull-ups. And we both got up there, and the first thing we did, jump up on the bar and do like as many reps as I can do that first set. And so I probably got 15 reps. Well, how long do I need to rest after that 15 reps? Quite a few, maybe 3 to 5 minutes before I could go again. And so my curve was like 15 reps the first set, then maybe like 10, then maybe like 6, and then like 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and 1. And it took me maybe 20, 25 minutes to get 100 pull-ups in. And then what we did was we set a timer, and we would do 3 reps every 30 seconds. So you do 3 reps, rest, 3 reps, rest, 3 reps, rest. And you can just crank that through. You can go really, really quickly through. Eventually we got 4 reps and then rest the remainder of the seconds, 5 reps, and then rest the remainder of the 30 seconds. And when I can do 5 reps, rest the remainder of 30 seconds, which is probably 15 to 20 seconds, I can get 100 pull-ups in under 10 minutes. And so I got the finite amount of work done in a lesser amount of time, right? And that's really the goal of our endurance training, is to be able to do more work and not see profound fatigue from it. And there's a ton of different examples there. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. But the most important thing is to continue to say, I want to work really heavily on my aerobic ability to deliver energy. And I also want to make sure that I'm really, really strong, because then my muscles have a greater economy or efficiency. A super strong athlete that can do a 300-pound squat, for example, doesn't have to do a lot of power output to do a single body weight squat. And so that's the whole thing, that goes back into Tony Anero's great saying, which is, unless you can do the moves, there's nothing to endure. And so that's the really important part to start with, is like, I got to be strong and powerful first.
And what is really interesting, though, even if someone did your pull-up experiment, they might still be inclined to make themselves as fatigued as possible. There's this need to want to feel fatigued. We kind of have this suffer culture in mind, like, in order to improve, that you need to suffer. And I think just working power endurance kind of feeds into that. And it feels like we're doing really good work, and, we can pat ourselves on the back and say, I worked so hard, I'm so destroyed. But clearly you can work this energy system by not doing that. And I think it's the trust in that as well, that people might not be there yet, because they're just so used to having to suffer and thinking that this is how they need to do it. So do you think you could talk a little bit, like, of your experience with athletes? Like, people want to go to fatigue. How do you kind of deal with that? Or, do you say anything to your athletes to convince them, like, hey, you don't need to kill yourself?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is to create a different training goal than be as tired as possible. And what's super clear is when you go to the crag and you want to send a route. And so what I talk about is a greater consistency in behavior between gym and crag. When I go to the cliff, I'm resting. I want to be as rested as I possibly can before I go up on a really pumpy route. And when I get on that route, I'm taking as many rests as I can to keep myself as calm and as aerobic as possible. I'm breathing well. I'm trying to be efficient, and you name it. But then if my behavior in the gym is, I got to get in there, I'm not even going to warm up, because it's easier for me to feel pumped if I just get on the wall and start traversing. Or I'm just going to do campus ladders every 30 seconds for 45 minutes or whatever it might be, that's going to make me super tired. But that's not really what we're looking for. And if we think back to the graphic we just shared, skill and technique, movement capacity, mental performance, all of those things are what energy expenditure is about in the performance environment. And so I want to encourage my athletes to take the time required to build a foundation for that. Generally, that is in the form of more climbing without getting into a profoundly fatigued state. And so we have some basic things, like, you should not get to labored breathing in most of your endurance training. It should be one of these situations where you're like, oh yeah, I'm nice and calm and my heart rate is low. Now, my forearms can be ridiculously pumped and my heart rate won't be very high. Why is that? Because the forearms are generally a pretty small muscle. And so they don't ask a lot from the heart and lungs. But I need to avoid just training that muscular endurance in the forearms. And this is the mistake that a lot of people are making, where they're like, oh, I'm going to train endurance by doing repeated hangs on pulling against a strain gauge, or I'm going to just do forearm endurance. forearm endurance is a very, very small part of muscular endurance in climbing. And I advise some of these athletes that are climbing in the big, like Santolina cave in Spain, and they're like, yeah, I mean, your arms get pumped, but your back gets really tired. It's really hard to breathe because it's steep and the lungs are being compressed. The legs get tired from holding these rest positions. And so real endurance training for climbing must involve climbing. We can finish sessions with some forearm endurance, but the thing of like, can I get as tired as possible in my forearm should be the last thing we do in one of these sessions. And it should also fall into that same framework of like, is this going to move me forward? Is it moving me toward this goal of being better at not being pumped? So a lot of general endurance training is sort of the foundation of all this thing. Do I have the ability to bring oxygen in? Remember, am I an intake limited athlete? If I can't go out and walk for 1 hour a day for 7 days a week, without feeling like I'm wiped out by that, I probably don't have the fundamental basis for specific sport endurance. So you might just not be a very fit person. And we see that with the urban bouldering culture. I drive to the bouldering gym. My approach is 30 feet of walking, and then I start doing hard bouldering. And then I stop when my skin gives out, and I drive back to my house. And a lot of people that don't spend much time outdoors don't develop that basic capacity that we might if we're just walking around Squamish for an entire day. And so that needs to be a fundamental part of it. And it's boring and it's not sexy and it's not that interesting to like go, oh, I need to go out and walk around my neighborhood for an hour. But it might be, again, something that is so important to the overall development of the athlete that all the gym training, all the forearm endurance stuff, all the gear you get to buy doesn't really matter if you just don't have that capacity. The second level of that then is, can I get the blood to the arms? Do I have the capillary network? Again, more climbing stimulates that development. And so it can be route climbing in the gym, or it can be a lot of lower intensity bouldering. And one of the things that I love is to try to encourage people to do like easy boulders on the minute as a basic capacity workout. And if you did 20 minutes of starting at the beginning of each minute, you just do an easy boulder and then hop down, rest the remainder of that minute. And you get to the end of that 20 minutes and you're like, okay, yeah, I've definitely done something, but I'm not ridiculously pumped. I'm not, my fingers don't feel destroyed. That's probably about the same zone, the appropriate zone. Then we rest about 10 minutes, then we do it again. So that's a total of 50 minutes of training. And that's a pretty good start. Like, can you do that? If you can't do that without being really, really, really pumped, we need to keep backing that off. We might even have to put in more rest. Like we talked about, do one boulder every 2 minutes until you can do that. But we need that capacity. We need to be able to do the boulder problems at all. And then we worry about that specific utilization, or am I overloading my arms enough? And that's the very last piece of it. And so that's when we go to steeper stuff that's more fingery, slightly higher grades potentially. But the main issue there is, do I have the foundation upon which to build power endurance? And so then we can look at how it all fits together and how much power endurance I need to do.
Awesome. And I do want to reiterate what you said about having just the general endurance in order to climb, but also maybe to live. Like I think you had mentioned 1 hour a day of walking. That is like, it's been studied that, in order to have a very healthy lifestyle, that should be something in your repertoire. And I know, like, even for myself, that has been really, really hard. And I personally have had to make a very conscious effort to walk around every day for at least an hour. And just doing that can actually, like, you do see the results in climbing just by doing 1 hour of easy walking. Yeah. So if y'all are interested in more of that endurance training, go check out our first training series podcast with Steve, we really dive deep into like ways to train that low level endurance. Okay, so what I would love to talk a little bit about is kind of the specific feeling in the forearm real quick. Like I think a lot of people don't really understand what the pump is. Like what is this feeling? Like what's actually happening in the forearm when I'm getting pumped?
Yeah. So when we look at this, like the pump in the forearm is a combination of a few things. One, it's an inability to move waste products out. And so you start to accumulate waste products within the muscle or in the blood, and it starts to feel really crummy. There's also another thing that starts to happen is as we start to use these muscles and they start to fill with blood, that we get this transient hypertrophy. So the muscles actually get bigger. And that's like this thing that, like is sick on a Friday night before you go to the bar. You're like, yeah, let's get all, we'll get all huge. And then I'm going to look all pumped up and I'm going to, be attractive to, potential mates. But the most interesting part of that is what we get is called auto-occlusion during that time. And auto-occlusion is a squeezing down of the blood supply, the tubes of blood going in and out of the forearm. As the muscles get bigger and take up more space, it actually squeezes down on the capillary network. And so then I can't push the blood in, I can't push the blood out. And when I get to there, I'm in real trouble. And so once I get to that level of pump, and there's like, if you read Sergio Consuegra's book, which is a really awesome book, The Science of Climbing Training, he talks about some research where it's like, once you get to this certain level of pump, there is no getting it back. You cannot bring it down. Like if you get a knee bar or whatever else within a reasonable amount of time, it might be a day ender for you. And so when we get to that pumped level of blood in the forearms, we've gone past the level that's effective for training. And so we can go into slight pump, we can go into kind of, starting to feel fatigue. But when we get worse, just like worse than that, ridiculously bricked on something, it's probably that we've gone way faster into fatigue than we should have for a positive training effect. A great way of looking at that, or an analogy that we might use, would be running. Like if I want to get good at a marathon, running out my door and then sprinting as hard as I can, as far as I can, is probably not the best way to start getting to 26.2 miles. Because it's going to take me a long time before I can run again. It might be many, many, many hours before I'm able to do that same power output. And so it's not like I'm going to sprint and rest, sprint and rest, sprint and rest. What you want is to get to where you're really, really good at fueling. You can let your muscles relax between these things, let the blood flow in and out really easily, and then you can perform at a really high level. There are climbers that can climb repeated, probably V10, V11 movement aerobically. And if we take it back to the running analogy, and it's weird that running is easier for climbers to understand, but the world record level marathoners are now running splits that are like 440s, and that's a pretty fast mile. And they're running super duper fast, and they're aerobic. I could probably run a 440 mile for about 100 feet before I needed to start slowing down to recover, because that would be, and then I'd be probably pretty fatigued from just that one effort of a sprint like that. But if I develop it appropriately, I'm going to be able to handle that aerobically, and I'm not going to get as ridiculously pumped. So if you're seeing that pump happen in your workout, you need to immediately change your work to rest ratio or drop the intensity of the work, because that's not going to allow you to develop yourself as an athlete nearly as quickly as staying below that threshold and doing more work.
Amazing. Awesome. And maybe let's talk about something a little bit more like practical on the wall. Let's say someone's like climbing at the red, like super overhanging, really long, getting super pumped. Let's talk about someone who's really trained for power endurance. Are they still feeling pumped when they're doing routes that are overhanging?
That's a really good point. It's a good starting point to talk about this, because when you watch elite level climbers performing, um, let's say World Cup level athletes, or climbers in the Flottinger Cave, or you name it, you can see some of these really amazing sends of 515s. And really often those athletes are aerobic. They get to a very difficult boulder. They try to do that difficult boulder, and they've then switched all the way back down to the alactic or the power system, and they go power. They hit a relatively good hold, and they're back to aerobic. And so if we looked at those zones as power endurance, and endurance, the power endurance zone is getting squeezed down the more fit they are. So they spend a very little amount of time in that zone, and they can jump between aerobic, easy, I'm only climbing V9 moves or whatever. And then they do some V14 movement, and then they jump back to V9. I can recover on a crimp. And so the elite level athlete isn't dealing with the same kind of pump that maybe the 12A climber is. I mean, I have been super ridiculously, incredibly pumped in my life. And those things where you're like, can barely hold on to these holes and you don't feel like you can close your hands. That just doesn't occur nearly as much as we reach these elite levels, because the performance environment doesn't require it. They develop enough aerobic ability in that forearm, in the system, in the ability to deliver to the working muscles, that they are not in that glycolytic zone nearly as much. And that kind of tilts into Joel Unima's model, and we can talk about that a little bit if you'd like. It's a really good way of seeing the way and the importance of power endurance.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome. And I do, before we go into that, is there there's this component of being able to shake out, like for rope, this is like primarily sport climbers, rope climbers, like they're able to shake out before they get into like these super high powerful moves. And there's some like tactics around not getting, like you could easily get pumped if you didn't rest strategically enough on these sections. Do you ever give like a percentage of pump to athletes that they shouldn't go over? So if they are trying to work a little bit of this, like in the beginning of this podcast, you were talking about like kind of like the mental side of like having to deal with being a little uncomfortable in the forearms.
Yeah.
Do you have some strategy around like, okay, I know now this is like a point of no return. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I now I've just kind of screwed the session. Is there any advice around that?
Well, when things start to go wrong in climbing endurance, lots of times they go wrong really, really quick. Like if you're out on a trail run and you're starting to get a little tired and you're running uphill and whatever, you can slow down, work on your breathing, whatever, and pull some of that back. But a few things happen in climbing, including this auto occlusion in the forearm. Like my heart rate's really high, my respiration's really high. I'm compressing my lungs so I can't breathe quite as well. So I'm not getting as much oxygen to the blood. So the blood isn't as oxygenated when it gets to the muscle. The muscle isn't receiving as much blood because it's occluded. And so all of these things start to become really apocalyptic. It's like, oh, total crisis. And what happens when that happens is it happens so quickly that people will go from like, I felt great, and then I was immediately pumped and I don't know what the hell happened. And that is really hard to know when it's coming unless you do a lot of training. And so the number I tell people is like, when you feel like you're 25% pumped, you need to start backing off, because 25% is probably actually more like 75%. But people are like, oh no, I got this. And then they're crushed. A good example is Charlie and I were just out in New England, and we were at a business conference, but we visited a couple of climbing gyms. And anytime I go to a new climbing gym, I'm just like so fired up. And we get into, we were in the bouldering project in Boston, and I'm just like, oh yeah, man, let's go. We're going to do all the yellows, then we're going to do all the reds, then we're going to do, and my rest periods change, my motivation's super high. And like within about 45 minutes, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm really fatigued and I'm still super psyched and whatever else. But I know that if I don't like force myself to rest here, my session's going to be over in the next 10 minutes. And so that's the same thing that happens when people are getting psyched about an endurance training program. They're like, man, if I can just do all my endurance today, I'm going to get to this really high level and it's going to be really amazing. But it's important to think about your endurance training like you're eating. You don't want to do all of your eating in one meal for the whole week. And like that, you don't want to do all of your endurance training that first session of the week. You want to like be really careful about spreading it out so you can do lots of it.
So I do have a question. I want to just make sure that we can really hone into, or maybe define, like, what is power endurance versus just being very efficient. So do you mind if we just explore that a little bit more? You love analogies. I love analogies. You like using the car analogy. Like power endurance is roughing your engine in third gear, like going down the highway in third gear. For people who don't drive manuals, if you're in third gear and you're driving down 80 miles an hour, that's like really hard on the engine. Your engine is revving really high. And you just spoke about elite level athletes. They don't spend that much time in that state. They're not revving their engines as high. So is it almost just a matter of learning when to shift? How to drive that car? It's like the question is, are we trying to practice being in third gear for a long time versus are we like, do we need to actually learn how to shift and work with our engine that we have so we're not even in that red zone very much? And do elite level athletes even train power endurance?
I think that the main thing that happens is elite level athletes are exceedingly good at behaving in the performance environment. They're not dealing with their tactics are good. They know how much to rest. They're giving really clean, good efforts on things. It's not like oh my gosh, I'm afraid up here and I'm over gripping or whatever. And so there's a lot of the volume that they're able to put forth. And it's incredible when you look at the total number of movements that some of the elites do at this point. I think the really important thing there is like, is this sustainable? Can I have a 6-hour training session at this intensity and this rest period? And lots of us try to shortcut that. And so I think you're totally right, is that they know when to shift. The other thing is lots of people are not willing to do enough easy movement. But I think a really important key here is that you need to be doing lots of easy movement and you need to be doing lots of hard movement. And it's a lot easier and happier and more satisfying to do a medium amount of medium movement. And so I feel like a really great place to start is to say, I'm going to do one session where I'm going to try to do 60 boulder problems in one training session. And for lots of people, that's like maybe not even a marked boulder. It's like, can I climb to the top of a bouldering wall using any holds that are on it 60 times in one training session? And that might be one boulder every 2 minutes. So that's a 2-hour session. But lots of people just don't have that capacity, but it's got to be easy. I've got to be able to do the whole thing. And when I get to the end, I want to be performing with relatively good form. I want to be close to how I looked when I started. Okay, likewise, on the other end, I need to be training at a really high intensity. I need to be able to do hard movements, because if I never, ever, ever try to do my limit, say my limit is V8, if I'm never trying V8 moves and I'm always just doing volume, V8 moves are always going to overload me. And so if I get good at doing hard movements, holding those positions, knowing how to breathe with my lungs compressed, then I get pretty strong there. And so if I can get good at hard movements, get good at easy movements, then I can start to move between them more easily, or as your analogy states, know when to shift gears. Otherwise, I'll get onto, if I get to, I'm climbing a route and I get to like some kind of V4, V5 move, I'm going to panic. I don't know how to handle this. If I'm not breathing fully, if I have not done hard moves recently, and I'm just in endurance easy mode. And so we really do need to play with that gamut, but really to those two sides. And so now might be a good time to talk about Joel Unima's model. We've talked about this a lot. And Joel's a climbing coach that I work with, and he is always looking for better ways to explain things to his athletes. And so the model is this. He says, imagine you have two buildings. You have the strength and power building, and then we have the aerobic energy building. And those two buildings are where we spend most of our time in training. Between those two buildings, connecting them is a cable, and that cable is your power endurance. And the cable can only get as tall as the one of the buildings. So if you want higher power endurance, you're not going to be able to have this cable that's arcing above the heights of the building. It's just a steel cable. And so if I want more power endurance, I either need to get stronger or more aerobically fit. And as I move those two buildings up, the cable continues to get higher and higher. And so power endurance will follow general endurance and strength and power. There's really nobody that has a super high level of aerobic endurance and a super high level of strength and power that can't handle a little bit of power endurance there. And if we're training power endurance, really all we're doing is tightening up that cable between the two buildings. We can't take it, again, we can't bend it up against gravity above the height of those buildings. And so I can basically just maintain it. Then a couple of weeks a year, I crack open Steve's Power Endurance book. I do some of those drills and I tighten up that cable for a peaking phase for a route climb or a competition. But it's really critical that we don't spend a lot of time trying to get fatigued. And instead, most of our year is at this endurance, aerobic endurance zone, or the strength and power zone. It's cool. I think it's really great news to say, hey, here's one of these many, many facets of climbing that you don't need to train every damn day. Because most of us think that, oh my God, I suck at strength. I suck at power. My ring finger strength is awful. I can't do the splits. I get tired. I don't eat well. And you have all these things you need to work on. And if I can say, I don't need to go out and get sickly pumped in the gym today, it's real. I think that's great news. It's one thing you don't have to be working on all the time.
I love that analogy. We should definitely have some sort of graphic for that. And one thing I do want to kind of come back to was you did say like, okay, so endurance, it is a lot of easy movement, but I think we have to do it in almost like quotation marks, because like an elite level athlete, like you said, their easy movement is like V9, and so you can train your easy movement to be harder and harder, over time. And I really do like your like every minute on the minute drill, because you can see that change like over weeks, months, even over a year, where if you started just doing V0s on the minute, and then a couple weeks later, now you've actually put in a couple V1s and not and be able to start and finish and feeling the same way. And then over time, those numbers look a little different. And that's a really cool and I think sneaky way of working endurance with that strength component as well, because you are getting stronger, but you're also working that low level endurance. Can you talk about some of your favorite drills that you like to kind of work like this, it's almost like stealth way of working power endurance?
Yeah, I one of the things that I like to do is, well, there's a couple of things. One is slow resistance exercise. And to introduce this, I'll tell you a story. I had an athlete that was working a granite cave boulder, and working on coming out this thing. It was many, many moves. It was taking him more than 90 seconds to get out the cave to the lip crux on this thing. And he was by the time he got to the lip crux, he was like suffocating, like breathing super hard. And so his first inclination was to do these intervals on the air bike. I'm going to get on a dual action air bike. And if you've used one of those, you know they're really rough to ride. And he was doing 90 seconds as hard as he could go to improve his ability to handle that. Okay, that's not dumb. That's not, you know, like idiotic training, right? He's duration appropriate. He's trying to create the same experience in his heart and lungs. He's using his arms and legs. And so all those things are really good. The thing that he was missing out on was that it was a low tension environment. He wasn't getting aerobically gassed coming out this cave. It was the fact that he was having to hold so much tension in his body that it was sort of like breathing through a straw. He couldn't get the lungs full of air and thus couldn't deliver that oxygen to the muscles. And so what we did, instead of having him do sprints or like really, you know, difficult things on this air bike, is we said, okay, we're going to have you do an L pull-up. L pull-up is a hard pull-up with your legs straight out in front of you. And he was doing 3 seconds up, 3 seconds back down in this L position. This is a good climber. He's really strong. But 3 seconds up, 3 seconds down, and he would do 3 reps of that. And then he would step down, grab 2 kettlebells, bring them up into rack position, and do 3, again, 6-second front squats. And if you've done rack front squats with kettlebells, again, the lungs are compressed. What I'm trying to do with both of these resistance exercises is get him into a position where he has to hold tension in his core, in his thorax, so he can't fully expand his lungs, but he's doing hard work there. These are really non-specific things. They're not like the problem, right? But they're addressing what's going on in his system. And so you would do 3 pull-ups, 3 squats, then you take a big rest. Then you do 3 pull-ups, 3 squats, you do a big rest. And then we would have him, of course, doing hard bouldering as well. But the most important thing there is that the athlete is addressing the actual demands of what's going on in that performance environment. And so I think that that's a really good drill. Can I climb slowly? Like, can I set my kilter board back to 55 degrees and climb super duper slowly and statically out it? There's no problem on the kilter board, even if you're just using open holds at 55 degrees, that doesn't require a tremendous amount of tension through your torso. And so can I create drills around that required tension? Because sometimes the ability to deliver, like we've talked about earlier, is the limiter rather than my forearm endurance. Like doing just fast, hucky problems out the kilter board might not really address that exact problem. Lots of knee barring, drop kneeing, bicycles, all of the slower techniques in steep climbing help us address that system. And so I think that that's an important thing. The other thing is, if you just can't do, like if you just don't have the capacity to do 60 minutes worth of boulder problems on the minute drill, you could go and say, I'm going to do 5 boulder problems on the minute. So that's 5 minutes of work. Then I'm going to take a break, switch into my shoes, and I'm going to go ride an air bike or do a rowing machine or do a Stairmaster for 5 minutes. Then I'm going to come back. And you can go to a more general, less intense activity and slowly add more climbing and slowly reduce the general activity over time and still have that same effect. These are pretty fatiguing anyway. And even though you're not going to be ridiculously pumped, it's a really good way of getting that power endurance up there. How do I know when my power endurance has improved? What's the test for that? There's a couple of things that are really good for testing, but they're not great training because they're really fatiguing. One of them would be if you have a spray wall at home. I have a 30-degree spray wall covered in big holds. And I can go on that wall and I'll just climb open holds, no stopping, no resting, no shaking out, and time it. If I can go from 4 minutes to 6 minutes, I've probably seen an improvement in my ability to output power endurance. I know that's primarily aerobically driven, but I'm seeing that number improve. The wall's not changing. I've climbed on that wall a ton, so it's not like I'm learning anything. And that's a really good test. You could also have an actual route or boulder problem out at your local crag. That's a good test for you on that. Can I do this route without getting ridiculously pumped? The final one that's probably the simplest for most people is to do open laddering on a campus board with a kick rail, and just do the number of moves and time. And so I can get on there, I'm going to set my timer, and I can start moving. And you usually move about one hand a second. And you don't have to be doing crazy moves. You're just moving around back and forth on the board. It's very basic. It's a very simple test, but it's going to give you an indication. If you go from only being able to do 40 moves, 40 seconds to doing 80 moves, 80 seconds, probably you're seeing an improvement in that local muscular endurance. And again, those aren't like, oh yeah, you need to be doing that exercise 3 times a week to improve it. That's just your testing protocol. If we're constantly training to the test, if I'm always just practicing what I'm going to be tested on, it doesn't make for a good test. And so we want to be, only use those when we test once a month or once a quarter. And so I know that's a big mouthful of stuff, but the primary thing with our power endurance training these days is to do like sub-maximal power endurance stuff. Now, let's talk about, do you guys have any questions before I move on to the actual in-season power endurance development stuff?
I guess with the resistance training that you just mentioned with the L-sit pull-up and the front squat, it seems like you're actually just like you're only doing 3 reps, specifically for this athlete because they had a very specific route that they were training for. I guess what I'm thinking about is that something that you could train year round, or is that specifically for when you're ramping up to send this problem? Like, because like that training, it's hard, but maybe it's not quite as fatiguing, maybe as the climb that you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I think it would be valuable for some athletes to do slow, high tension exercises in their strength training, probably close to year round. And again, you don't have to go like, oh, I'm doing only this now. And that's one of the mistakes that we always make and things like, oh, I should do explosive training. I'm going to be explosive on every exercise. Same thing here. Let's do some slow stuff. What we're training there is the ability to keep breathing under tension. And that is a really hard skill for people. And if they can master that skill, it cleans up a lot of other problems. It's like a master skill for power endurance or endurance, is just being able to remember to breathe and breathe fully while we're in an intense situation. And you remember this from the Strong First stuff, Mercedes, is breathing behind the shield. Like, can I maintain my tight abdomen, my tight muscles, and still be able to breathe? Because most of us can like hold our breath and climb out the moon board, but can I continue to keep climbing and keep that oxygen coming? Because if I don't, that's it. I mean, when the oxygen stops, the endurance stops.
Awesome. All right, you can go ahead and actually let's do a time check, Steve. How long do you have? You have to leave.
I have maybe about 20 minutes. So
okay, awesome. Yeah, let's talk about what you were about to dive into.
So 4x4s and other power endurance oriented drills are appropriate to do. But when we do them is really limited. I think that it's important to have a giant base of endurance, a giant base of strength, and build those up over several months. And then within the month before I really want to have a peaking phase, that I'm getting ready to go on a trip. The national finals bouldering comps coming up. I have a combined format comp coming up. That's when we can start to put some of this power endurance work in there. When I want to start ramping up power endurance, I need to still do endurance at a maintenance level, meaning I still need to go do easy stuff. I still need to do strength and power at a maintenance level, but I can start to emphasize my power endurance capacity. And one of the best ways to do this is to do linked circuits that don't allow you to rest, but to do them at a level that you can complete the last rep of the last set with the same amount of good form and focus as you did the first one. And so this is where people make a mistake on a 4x4, is they get so bricked on the 4x4 that the last sets look awful. Now, to explain what a 4x4 is, if people don't do them, this is a pretty good simple format for a workout. You pick 4 boulder problems and you do them in back to back, boom, 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 boom. And then we take a big break. And then we do those same 4 boulder problems 3 more times. So a total of 16 boulders. Most of my athletes will then take a big break, 15 to 20 minutes, and then repeat that same thing for a total of 32 boulders in a session. Now, what's really important is that boulder 32 looks good when they're climbing it, and they aren't like starting at V5 on the first ones and ending up at V0 on the last ones. And so we need to adjust the intensity of the boulder problems and the rest periods so that can happen. Always start with, can I complete the workout at all? So my first inclination with anybody is to say, let's do all of these at V0 and see how it goes. And then if that goes fine, we can start increasing the intensity of the boulder problems. If it doesn't go fine, we need to increase the rest periods, right? We need to have bigger rests between our sets of 4. And so I think that the people get tripped up in this and they're like, oh man, if I can just get a little bit more pumped and just survive this workout, it's going to go really well. But where I think most 4x4 training programs or implementation of them falls flat is people do them 2 or 3 times and they're like, whoa, that really sucked. I hope it worked. I'm not going to do it anymore. And what I'd like to see is somebody do that workout 8 times. So 2 times a week for 4 weeks, or 3 times a week for 2.5, 3 weeks. And really ramp up that power endurance ability, and then shut it off and go perform. But you need to do it enough times that your body is stimulated to adapt to that. Otherwise, it's just traumatic. One of my favorite movies when I was a kid was a thing called The Road Warrior, and they're racing around this post-apocalyptic Australian desert. And one of the things, like, when Mad Max is like about to get caught by the bad guys, is he opens up this bottle of nitrous oxide his engine and he can rocket away from these guys. Nitrous isn't a really great thing for your motor. And so you can turn on this nitrous, which is your power endurance training, do it really, really briefly, get super good endurance, and then you better turn that thing off. And so 3-4 weeks of power endurance training once or twice a year, and then that's it. There's a ton of different drills for this. They're going to put you in that glycolytics level, but the better you get, the less and less and less you'll actually need it, and the less you'll spend time in that zone. You'll move from building 1 to building 2 and not spend too much time. That cable between the buildings gets really, really short.
What I'm still hearing, though, is even though you're training power endurance, you're still chasing this quality of movement throughout the whole session. And I think people still get that wrong. Even if they are training power endurance for only a couple weeks, they're doing exactly what you had said not to do, which is like, starting at V5, and then the end of the session, they're like, I can't even hold V0 anymore. So I think this is a really, really important factor to think about as you're going into power endurance, is like keeping the quality high. And would you say, like, once that quality starts to drop, that's your stopping point in a power endurance session?
Yeah, and that's really hard because people are like, oh, I can do it. I can gut it out, right? I can keep going. And that's a really, really great quality, but I want to save that for the performance environment. Here's what I see. People train like a maniac in the gym, and they get to the crag and they start to get a little bit tired, and they're like, oh, I think I'm going to call it a day, man. Let's crack some beers, right? That's where this person needs to be getting after it. The performance environment is where you fight to the death. that you go really hard on those things. But in the gym, I want you to prepare and prepare and prepare. I want you to get to where you're not getting fatigued and then take it to the limit when you're out there. The number of times I see people, you know, getting a little bit tired at the crag, a little bit tired on a route, and grabbing a draw or taking or whatever is really, really high. And very often, the people that are training the hardest in the gym or have the appearance of training the hardest in the gym just don't have what it takes when it gets out into that environment. And so I think it's really important to say, okay, I'm going to have discipline in the gym. I'm going to do this right. I'm going to make the body change its way of behavior. And then when I get out to the crag, I'm going to see what this thing can do.
Okay, so we talked about, or you talked about maybe choosing 4 weeks just before performance season, let's say before a trip or before you go to nationals, you have a competition, to really focus on power endurance and then to turn it off, right? And my question is, after you turn off your phase of power endurance, how long will it take you to see maximal benefits? Because I'm sure the week after, you're probably pretty fatigued still. Do you know what I mean? Like, how
Yeah.
long should an athlete, like, what's the timing? Let's say my nationals are, May 1st. Like, when should I stop training power endurance to really start my performance phase and feel good?
Yeah, probably 1 to 2 weeks.
Mhm.
I love having my athletes that are going to they're traveling overseas, train power endurance right until the day before they leave or the 2 days before they leave, because then they travel and they get to the crag and they have to like kind of get used to the rock there and whatever else. And it usually ends up being 7 to 10 days before they get a high level of performance. Um, with competition climbers, it's more difficult. And there's a whole other thing with the combined format that's starting to come into play. But with competition climbers, if you're if you're totally killing yourself trying to get fit enough for nationals, there's a chance you won't qualify because you're so destroyed from your training that you can't perform in the competitions leading up to that. And so it's always this funny mix of like doing enough but not too much. And again, that just emphasizes the point that we shouldn't be destroying ourselves in the training all the way up until the last minute. Like, if you're in national league team play, say in basketball or something, you don't want to like get fit for the championships. You need to be fit so that you can get there. And so it's always uh, a tough call, but strength and power and lower intensity endurance don't wipe us out the same way power endurance does. And so whether or not we need to really kill ourselves in the power endurance sessions or not depends a lot on athlete performance.
Yeah, and that is sort of my bigger question really is, who even needs to train power endurance? Because in my philosophy, I think it's really, it's the thing that most people think they need. Oh, certainly that's what they want to train, but most people think that's what they need one. Maybe that's actually what they need the least. Maybe what
Yeah.
they really need to work on are actually, strength and power, the endurance, and I would argue also the mindset stuff, like not, revving the engine too high just because we're feeling nervous or an edge.
Yeah.
And power endurance to me just feels like the cherry on top. This is really, the very last thing if you are trying to perform at a pretty high level.
I think that's an important point. And maybe to drop back into our world of analogies, like a student that does all of the work throughout a semester probably shouldn't be all that stressed about finals. They don't need to cram. They don't need to stay up late at night. They don't need to like, oh my God, I got to get my act together, because they started doing the work from day one. And I think that an athlete that has really great aerobic endurance, really great strength, we don't need a ton of that stuff. And again, to go back to Joel Yanima as an athlete, not as a coach, he is a fantastically high level boulderer and endurance rock climber. And we spend almost zero time creating any power endurance for him. Why is this? Because both of those other capacities are so high that we don't really need to do it. And the same is true. I coach a elite female athlete named Chelsea Rude, and same thing there. like we very rarely do those circuits. It's can we get you a little bit stronger? Can we get your general endurance up? And she's, former national level competitor, but she's in her late 30s now, and she's climbing better than she ever has. So
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I like to share that because you're talking about all these elite level athletes. You know, I'm not an elite level athlete, but I see those same concepts be true for me. I'm someone where people just say I have naturally good power endurance, but I think what I really do have is just maybe a good matched mix of endurance and also strength and power. And I can put those two together in a very efficient way on the rock. And so
yeah,
then I just seem to have really good capacity because I'm one of these people. I can show up on ropes, you know, being a boulderer, and people like, wait, what? You can climb
yeah,
on
right.
ropes too. And I think it really comes down to that. I just want to emphasize this because this is not just true for elite athletes. Like everybody can work on power endurance by actually working on endurance and strength and power instead of just focusing on cramming for the final that you just, you know, that was a really great analogy, you know, just work on it year round, very consistently, and
Yeah.
you feel really good about your final exam.
I I think the bigger picture, and we can tie this into longevity, into general health, is that people want to feel capable when they're doing their sport. And part of feeling capable is doing the fundamentals. And that's the thing, is like when you're 45, when you're 55, when you're 65, you still want to be like, oh yeah, I'll go to Waco and go bouldering, or I'll go climb the Grand Teton, or I'll hike across this mountain range. You want to have that capability and not feel like, oh my gosh, if I'm going to perform, it needs to be, on slightly overhanging 12A at 10 sleep, because that's the only place that I feel like I've developed my capability. What we want is to be able to climb. Let's do any rock climb anywhere in the world, anytime. And that's what we really seek to develop with our athletes.
Yeah, totally. And actually, it reminds me of one of the concepts that Mercedes and I love talking about, which is this idea of really consistent training throughout the year and really making training a lifestyle. Because often what we see when people want to train is they decide for 6 or 8 weeks out of the year, and now I want to train. And that's when the idea of I need to cram for the final comes in. The people are like, okay, now I'm training for 6 to 8 weeks and I want to see results. And that's when people, power endurance is also this kind of thing that can give you results somewhat quickly, but it can also be fatiguing and you're not working on the foundations. So that's really one thing for people to keep in mind as they're thinking about training, especially if they're somewhat new to training, to really make training a long game and really work on the foundations
Mhm.
a long
Yeah,
term. Yeah.
it's it's real easy to get a little bit stronger, if you've got that foundation in place. I can pivot my fitness easily, but I can't just rebuild it from zero. And that's true in so many facets of our lives. And so I think that, you know, power endurance is almost like and like, oh my God, I need to do an emergency intervention here because I really want to do this climb and I haven't done my homework. And so I think for a lot of people, and especially when they're more and more experienced, I see less and less call for this particular energy system from them.
I think
Wonderful.
that, well, going back to like the cramming for the final, like Steve, as a coach, this, like Katya, we tend to get clients who just want to train for 2 to 3 months. They're like, hey, I've got this trip. And it sometimes it feels a little unfair, even like as coaches, like it's unfair on us to be like, okay, we're gonna do our best, but like you really maybe should have started training for this months, even like years ago. And
Yeah.
that's why we do incentivize a lot of our athletes to stick with us for at least a year,
Yeah.
because that's when you make remarkable changes and you can really develop what you need to for the projects that you're about to do.
Yeah. I have a friend that's a financial advisor, and he says his his most common call is from somebody in their 50s that's like, oh my God, I need your help and I need it now. And he's like, man, if you'd have called me even 5 years ago, we'd be a lot, you just can't make the stock market improve faster than it improves, and you've only got so much time. And so I think like even a simple, like I'm going to lift weights like 30 minutes a day, strength oriented, every, 2 days a week, all the time. That's like 50% of the physical capability of your athleticism. I'm going to go for a general walk on top of that. And that's another, 20% of anything you can do athletically. And so if you don't have that foundation, it's really hard to build specific fitness on top of that. And so I think that that's the thing is like, can you do the boring stuff? Can you continue to like understand the value of simple, basic things that have to happen all the time? And if you can't, then your ability to improve overall is going to be really limited.
All right, so I actually have a question that like I tend to get like specifically like through the year if they're training and they're not training power endurance. So like, okay, I understand I maybe shouldn't get pumped all the time, but I go out on the weekends and I'm trying my sport climbing projects and I'm getting pumped, and then I just like keep getting pumped so that I can continue to try this thing. um what how do you approach this with your athletes? Like, yes, they have these projects, they might have to get pumped. How do you strategize that without compromising their energy system now and even the ability to recover from those sessions?
Yeah, I think that mindset switch between a preparatory and a performance phase is really important. Um, And so one of the issues that we have is like we have people that are always in a performance phase. I'm always out on my project. I'm on my project. I'm doing a project. My project is this. My draws are on this. My project is this. And I think they like having the project more than they like climbing in a lot of ways. They like being a climber, rather than climbing. And so the identity of like I'm always trying this thing is more powerful than I'm actually preparing to be a better athlete. And so I think the important thing there is to start with strategy. Like, when are you going to go try this project? And what are the things we're going to do to get you ready for it? If they haven't put in the base during a preparatory phase, then they can only expect mediocre results. And so I do believe that climbers can have a 1 to 3 month performance phase when they're climbing at their very hardest at least 2 times a year. And so that's anywhere between 2 and 6 months a year that they can be climbing really hard stuff. But they want more than that. They want to be able to run their 4 minute mile off the couch anytime, but they don't want to do the work for it. And so I think if you're not spending time laying down that foundation, of course you're going to be ridiculously pumped on this thing. But we want to get to a situation where that athlete has put the foundation down, that they aren't getting that terribly killed on those things, and that the moves are actually hard for them, or that they're just having to do an endurance-based thing. And again, even with that athlete, that window of power endurance should close, but they need to be able to say, during my preparatory phase, when I'm preparing, when I'm off season, I'm not going to go out and get ridiculously pumped on a route. My focus is on the things that are happening in the gym. When I go to the crag, I'm going to either be doing lower intensity volume or trying to do really hard moves on things, but not getting wasted. When it comes close, or when I switch over to performance phase, then my gym intensity drops, my gym duration drops. And in that performance phase, then I'm really focusing on that thing. And if I did the preparatory phase, I don't know why I can't say that word today. If I did the preparatory phase correctly, I won't be as ridiculously pumped at the crag. But always projecting, and projecting outside of your prepared limit is a mistake. And that's the other thing. If you look, like 8A is a really cool site for analyses. And if you look at the elite level boulders or route climbers, they have a really clean pyramid if you look at their rankings. like people that have done 15A have probably done 2 14Ds, and they've probably done 8 or 10 14Cs and a whole bunch of 14As. Then you get down into this like 11 and 12 level rock climber, and it's like they'll done one 11C. They haven't done an 11D, but they've done one 12A, and now they're working on their 12B. That person is outside of their physical capability. And I'm all for like pick a super limit project and put your heart into it, but physically it just doesn't play out. And so that person just hasn't done the preparation.
Awesome. Okay, we are basically at time. Do you have any parting thoughts on power endurance or how to train power endurance before we wrap this up?
The most important thing is to not chase it. It should result from great training rather than be the focus of your training. Remember that the energy expenditure that we put out when we're out there at the crag involves movement capacity, our skills and our techniques, and our mental game. And so it's not just how much endurance I have in my forearm. And if somebody is giving you a power endurance training program that's all about just increasing the local muscular endurance in your forearms, I think it's a gigantic mistake, because all of those factors come in, as well as breathing and overall total body endurance, not to mention your physical capacity for work. And so we've got to look at it more globally. Am I the kind of person that can go out and climb all day at the crag? If not, why? Is it hard for me to walk to the crag? Is it hard for me to do 6 or 7 pitches in a day? Those things have to be answered first before we really worry about power endurance in the forearm at all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Steve. So next week we're going to be talking about recovery, and I think this actually
Nice.
ties in really, really well with the power endurance conversation from today. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, you guys.